Joining us now, back by popular demand from Rice University Baker's Institute for Public Policy, is Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He's a fellow for the Middle East and an all-around expert in the Middle East with a long resume. He is a doctor. He's a fellow, as I said, in the Middle East. He worked as a senior Gulf analyst at the Gulf Center for Strategic Studies between 2006 and 2008. And he was co-director of the Kuwait Program on Development, Governance, and Globalization in the Gulf States at the London School of Economics from 2008 to 2013. And he is joining us now. Dr. Ulrichsen, great to have you back, man.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Good morning.
It's always a little intimidating when I get you on because of your storied education, research, and background. So I'll try to keep up with you. But Doctor, I wanted to get you on today for a couple of reasons. I want to talk about the Gulf a little bit, but can we start with the European Union Commission adding, get this, Saudi Arabia, Panama, and 4 U.S. territories to a blacklist of nations it considers a threat because what they said was lax controls on terrorism, financing, and money laundering. That's from the European Union, and they're doing a crackdown. Immediately, Britain went ballistic and said, well, wait a minute. Saudi Arabia gives us a lot of money. We're their friend. And then you got the UAE involved in this. Wow. What do you think?
Well, it is quite ironic that the UK is about to leave the EU and has suddenly tried to shape EU policy on this particular issue by trying to defend and remove Saudi Arabia from the list, in part because, as you say, there's a lot of British-Saudi trade that they want to try and safeguard. The EU, I think, is more determined to move ahead, and so there is a consensus among most, if not all, of the member states that there have been loopholes in terror financing and money laundering, and that pressure needs to be put on the Saudis and to some extent the Emiratis to take it a bit more seriously.
Yeah, but they don't. I mean, come on, Dr. Ulrichsen. You can put pressure on the Saudis and UAE. I mean, they just have a history. They just do whatever they want, right? So, but
well, I think in the past that's been the case, and I think in the past, especially with some of the financing, well, most of the financing for 9/11, this is an issue that raised its head nearly 20 years ago, and I suspect that the mood in Brussels is that rhetoric hasn't necessarily changed and that more kind of actionable measures are now necessary.
So if the Brits are getting out of the European Union, what exact right or leverage do they have to whine about a decision the EU made when they're trying to get out of it?
Well, yes, and I think that's one issue they haven't really probably thought about. British influence as part of a 28 group is magnified, although on the other side of the coin, once the Brits have left, they can probably carry on trading as they wanted to with partners such as the Saudis and the Emiratis. So the British government might want to try and have it both ways.
Well, that appears what they're attempting to do. There's a lot of countries on this list, and do you think that other countries will follow suit? Because the U.S. immediately put a statement out from the Department of Treasury questioning or bringing into question the way that the EU came about this list. Again, it seemed to protect the Saudis and UAE and their investments in the U.S. So my question is it even going to matter?
Well, I mean, anything the EU does is always complicated by the fact that there are 28 member states, soon to be 27, and it's easier for outside organizations or countries like the US or the Saudis or the Emiratis to try and divide the states and to try and deal bilaterally with individual states who are more willing to break rank than follow the EU consensus. And so I suspect that the US or the Saudis or the Emiratis could try and just pick countries off. And of course, there's a lot of lucrative investment and trade at stake. And so you could easily see Eastern European countries, for example, or some of the Mediterranean countries be sort of peeled away from an EU consensus.
You know what the irony of this is to the layman? Dr. Ulrichsen, that follows the Middle East like me without the intensity, obviously, of your research, is that, okay, let's see, the Saudis and the Emirates accused Qatar financing terrorists, yet Qatar's not on the list of the EU, but the Saudis and the Emirates are. So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously probably the biggest irony of all. The Saudis, the UAE, have joined together with Bahrain and Egypt to form this so-called anti-terror quartet. Of course, on the one hand, those three of those four countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, accounted for 18 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11. And, of course, in terms of terror financing, they've now been called out. And, calling Qatar a sponsor of terrorism while being placed on a list and called out for your own shortcomings is obviously going to be highly embarrassing. The Qataris very quickly responded in 2017 by strengthening their already considerable cooperation with the U.S. and other partners on tracking terror financing flows and on cracking down and on working with governments around the world to try and make it a more safe and secure environment. And so you see very clearly the difference between rhetoric and reality in this Gulf dispute, which is now almost 2 years old.
With no end in sight, but the Qataris have basically moved on. I mean, their economy is fine. They figured out how to get around it. Some people say they're better off that the whole thing happened to them because they've opened up trade routes. Prices have come down for average consumers and choices have gone up, and they've been able to continue to grow their economy. There's a humanitarian crisis, no doubt, because people can't move freely between the countries the way they had been. So students are affected, colleges affected, families are affected. Husbands and wives from different areas can't see their families. So that's a mess. But economically, I mean, I think you look at the Qatari economy now, it's better than it was before the Gang of Four did the blockade.
Well, the figures for 2018 show that GDP in Qatar increased faster than in the neighboring states that have been blockading them. Mm-hmm. And the Qatari stock market outperformed its neighbors as well. Mm-hmm. And as you said, economically, they've restructured their trade routes. They've put in place alternative options, mm-hmm. some of which are cheaper. And they've really been stress tested and found their economy to be much more resilient than it was perhaps 3 or 4 years ago. And so many in Qatar would argue that on an economic basis, the blockade was a sort of a real shove to become more resilient, more self-sufficient, and a stronger and more diversified economy. As such, was a painful but, on balance, a positive outcome. Now, the humanitarian aspect of it is, of course, the one that needs to be resolved, because you have families interlinked across boundaries in a way that is much greater than perhaps in a North American or European setting, and people continue to be divided, and not only divided but subject to ridicule and constant petty insults from blockading states. And this is the aspect that I think is now going forward to international human rights organizations, that freedom of movement, freedom of people to live together is being violated by just sort of political issues, and that's got to stop.
Well, the whole thing makes no sense, and I think UAE and Saudi should be embarrassed by this EU thing, because it's like the pot calling the kettle black, so to speak. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We are with Dr. Kristian Ulrichsen. He is a fellow for the Middle East. He is with Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and he has a very long, storied career in following the Gulf and the Middle East in a variety of business and academic and research and advisory positions. Dr. Ulrichsen, as these types of things go on, there still is not U.S. ambassadors in the Trump administration in some of these key countries. I mean, it's almost unbelievable that we're 2 years into a new administration and there's not a ambassador confirmed for Saudi Arabia. There's not an ambassador even named yet for Qatar. They had one, they withdrew the nomination. That was a career charge d'affaires. They pulled her. They said they were going to nominate Scott Taylor, former congressman, 2nd District in my area of Southeast Virginia. I've yet to see that name been nominated. In the meantime, we have states that are very important relations to us without ambassadors. I mean, what is the deal?
Well, yes, in the 3 countries in the Gulf that have been at the heart of the dispute over the past 2 years, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, there have been no ambassadors. There's also no ambassador in Turkey either, another key regional state. And this obviously affects the impact of U.S. diplomacy and the ability, I think, of the U.S. to try and bring the states together and pressure them to find a resolution. And I think we've seen efforts from the White House last spring to try and end the dispute, and they really got nowhere, partly because the Saudis and Emiratis made it very clear that they were in no mood to talk. And the ability of the U.S. to put pressure or to leverage them into talking, I think currently is compromised by the fact that there are no ambassadors on the ground. And until the Saudis and Emiratis agree to drop their maximalist demands, which leave no room for dialogue, then this crisis is just going to continue, I think.
Well, and without any ambassadors there's no way you're going to solve it. And as you said, Dr. Ulrichsen, U.S. negotiators there was a potential meeting at Camp David where, the key figures were going to get together, much like way back in 1978, I think Jimmy Carter put that Camp David meeting together. Remember that, with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat.
Anwar Sadat.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. Shows you how old I am, unfortunately, because I remember it vividly. And and I thought that was President Carter's finest moment, because he single-handedly really got them to the table, got them to Camp David, and got them to make a deal. And he really wouldn't leave the room until they hammered it out. He put everything aside, and I thought that was, as a president, that was his finest moment. And the U.S. was trying to do the same thing with this dispute, but they could never even get the people to come to the table, right? So
yes, and I mean of course the Carter agreement at Camp David has more or less lasted now for 40 years. I mean, there have been tensions along the way, but the basis of the agreement remains in place, and that's an achievement. I think the difficulty and difference today is that, unlike in 78, 79, when the Egyptians and the Israelis were willing to agree at least to discuss negotiations, right now the Saudis and Emiratis don't seem to even want to do that. And I think partly because the dispute is driven not only by emotional or pragmatic issues, but it's an emotional sense of anger that defies easy resolution because it's not necessarily pragmatic or rational.
Well, it's purely political, and it's for political gain. And as I've said many times, a lot of it has to do with I believe, the liberalization of Qatari citizens and especially women who are now running government agencies, running banks. I think when I was in talking to the executives that run Georgetown University there in Doha, they were telling me that like 65% of their master's enrollments going forward are Qatari women. They're female. And, the Saudis look at that, and it's not exactly their model. So I think that's one of the issues. But I want to get back to the lack of ambassadors, because this has been something that even the fake news media in the U.S. has not really picked up on. The legacy media has not picked up on this. The fact that the Trump administration has 4 key ambassador openings in this region 2 years in, unheard of. You mentioned them, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. No ambassadors, 2 nominated, still sitting there. And Qatar and Turkey don't even have nominees. And then here's what's odd. Around Christmas time, they leaked that former Congressman Scott Taylor was chosen by the president to be the ambassador to Qatar, right? Chosen by him. So that leaks in the news. And I talked to him, and he's like, yeah, I'm all in. I'd love to be able to do that. That was like in December. Here it is February, and he's not nominated. What is the holdup?
Well, I don't know what the specific holdup is. I saw the reports in December as well, and of course, people in Qatar had assumed that Molly Fee, the career Foreign Service officer, was going to be on track before Christmas to be nominated. So I think they were taken by surprise as well. I think there's a degree of perhaps concern that the State Department and the White House don't seem to be able to be on the same page, at least looking at some of the case for urgency to actually have more than 2 years into the second half of the first term of this presidency, that there needs to be an acceleration, because U.S. policy and diplomacy in the Middle East cannot act at full strength and cannot bring to bear the full tools of U.S. leverage without having these people in place, and that's got to change.
Look, I got the first nomination of the career diplomat. Like, I got that. I get it. I'm fine with that. I also understood she didn't get renominated, and they wanted to put Scott Taylor in there based on the fact that he's unbelievably qualified, served in the area, has been there many times. I think he's met the emir, very well qualified. But whether Scott Taylor or someone else, and obviously he got beat in Congress, he got defeated, so then he was available, so that changed. But I just don't know why the State Department doesn't move on it. And you try to talk to people in there, and you get 5 different answers from Wednesday about just getting this done. But I think it's a real stain right now. And look, if you're sitting there and you're Turkey or UAE or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, you're looking at yourself and saying, 2 years in, I don't even have an ambassador.
Yes, and I think Scott Taylor would have been a good choice. As you say, he has been to the region. He's met with senior Qatari leaders. There had been a relationship that had been growing, that's a relationship of trust, of getting to know each other. And I think the U.S. needs people right now in the region who know the region, who understand the region, and to kind of get some of the dynamics that are at play, because those dynamics are not necessarily serving U.S. interests. The attempt by the Saudis and the Emiratis to get the Trump administration to choose between them and Qatar was deeply offensive to U.S. interests, because all 3 countries are U.S. partners. There was no black and white choice, right or wrong. This is not Iran, for example, where you do have a sort of a good side and a bad side from a U.S. point of view. And so the attempt to bounce the administration early on into trying to pick sides was extremely detrimental to U.S. interests, and this needs to not happen again. Having ambassadors on the ground could at least try to help and to make sure this doesn't happen again, because it was extremely serious the first time around.
Message to U.S. State Department: we need ambassadors in key countries to be able to move the United States and the Trump administration's agenda forward, and also to be able to serve our interest and those countries in that region in a viable way. I don't know what the holdup is, but I would think this should be a top priority, and I hope they get on it. Dr. Ulrichsen, thanks for being with us, sir. I always enjoy your perspective and knowledge in having you on our show. Thank you, sir, so much.
Thank you very much.